Hello, my name is JStraszewski, and this is my capstone thesis, Engagement Strategies in the Classroom. In every classroom, there are two main parties involved, teachers and students, each of which have their own unique needs and wants. But as human beings in general, we aim to find order in disorder. And this is one of the main reasons teachers tend to plan things out and strategize heavily. Many teachers aim to mimic the real world in the classroom, but they're always plagued with the question, what is the best way to do that? To begin the background section, I'd like to talk about my personal context. The main reason why I pursued this particular research question was because I come from a multicultural background. I have a lot of influence of Argentine culture, as both my parents were born there, and I also have some influence of Italian, Spanish, and Polish culture. I was actually the first generation of my family to be born in the United States. So language always fascinated me. And above all, I always questioned what got us to engage with language, because I was exposed to at least 4 languages regularly at all family gatherings, and I never really understood why I was more inclined to speak certain languages over others. So as far as assumptions and beliefs go, the two main ones that drove this study were that the definition of engagement is not universal. It's definitely something that is emerging, and it changes from context to context. And lastly, that every teacher wants what is best for their students. So this brings us to the review of the literature. So as I said about the definition of engagement, it is something that is emerging. However, I did use a particular definition of engagement to drive the study, which refers to the degree of attention, curiosity, interest, optimism, and passion that students show when they are learning or being taught, which extends to the level of motivation they have to learn and progress in their education. I also viewed some psychological theories, one of which was the human schema theory, and this is basically how human beings organize their thoughts and therefore have a lens that is different than other people because of their different experiences, and this influences the way they approach their life, the way they behave, etc. And then the last few theories of psychology that I looked at in this literature review were those about familiarity. And there were conflicting ideas on this, one of which was that familiarity actually breeds contempt, that the more you see something, the more bored you get. However, these were mostly inclined to studying relationships among people, mostly that of marriage. And the other side of the scale was familiarity actually breeds likeness, that the more you are around something, the more you like it. And the more things that you allow yourself to like, the happier you are. So the culmination of all of these things led me to construct this particular research question. Does student familiarity with lesson strategies employed foster higher student engagement in the classroom? And I really wanted to peer into the alignment of attitudes and behavior in terms of engagement. So this is where we see the alignment of the definition of engagement, the schema theory, and then the likeness theories. So the research was designed to eventually be able to triangulate 3 different sources of data and arrive at overall conclusions. So we started off with 30 adolescent students as our participants, and this was in an existing high school Spanish foreign language course so that all environmental factors could be kept the same as a control. So had I used a different environment, there would have been other external variables that could have influenced their behavior. But I tried to keep everything very controlled. All the desks were in the same spot, the seating chart was not changed, the teacher was the same, the teacher aide was the same, the materials were the same, the layout of the class were the same, and finally the time of the course was kept the same as well. The 3 methods of data collection were through attitude surveys, behavior observation, and exit tickets. The attitude survey was done using SurveyMonkey, and there were 15 questions. The questions were all about their attitudes towards school, engagement, their foreign language course, their preferences for routine and predictability, and then finally creativity. So the survey was a 5-point Likert scale for each question. And really these were statements that students could show to the extent they agree or disagree or are indifferent with each of the statements given. Then, for the behavior observations, students were taught during 6 observed lessons, and a teacher aide that is existing in that class, they tallied the positive engagement behaviors during a 53-minute period. These lessons were conducted in 3 sets of 2. So each of the sets was presented in 2 ways: a usual method and unusual method. And the usual method was the prescribed lesson format that was given by my district and many other districts, the one that has an anticipatory set, objective, modeling, guided practice, independent practice, and closure. And then the unusual method did not employ this format, rather it was more unpredictable. The 3 sets of lessons were all about formal commands, superlatives, and irregular formal commands in Spanish. And then lastly, the exit tickets. They were each given at the end of the lessons, all 6 of the lessons, except for one, as you'll see in the limitations. And students were really just asked to rate their attitude regarding their confidence after each of the lessons. So in other words, they were to choose from 3 prescribed statements that I put on the projector, which were: 1, I feel good about the lesson, and then they would explain why. I feel good about the lesson enough I could teach it to a classmate, which shows an extended level of confidence, but also positive. And then finally, I do not feel good about the lesson, and then they would explain why. So after gathering all the research, here we have the findings from the attitude survey. So here we have a table, and you can see the 5 different categories that were used in the survey, which had their attitudes about engagement, routine, creativity, their foreign language course, and then their general attitudes about learning. So the main points that came from this were that a lot of them actually prefer to stay quiet than to speak out loud, which was actually 56.66%. And then a nice majority of them actually do not feel comfortable giving a speech, which is shown by the 33.33% that agree that they were actually comfortable giving a speech. So that shows that not many are comfortable. The other big thing that came from this is that most of them, 84.45%, say that they enjoy predictability in their routine. There were 4 questions that were catered to that, and that really kind of brought us to the bigger findings later on. And as far as the findings from the behavioral observations that were taken via tallies by the teacher aide as the teacher instructed, each of the 6 days can be noted here, each of which is labeled by usual and unusual lesson strategies. And they can tell through the t-tests that were conducted as well as the regression analysis that the relationship between the 2 data sets of day 1, day 2, then 3 and 4, then 5 and 6 were actually significant relationships because they had a p-value less than 0.05. And finally, here we have the findings from the exit tickets, which this was the 3rd data collection method that was given at the end of each of the 6 lessons, except for day 4, which we will again discuss in the limitation section. As you can see by the color-coordinated boxes, most of the days, regardless of whether it was a usual day or unusual instructional day, they were actually pretty positive. Very few experienced indifference or did not feel good about the lesson, and there were some few absences as well that should be noted in the data. Alright, so now that we saw all 3 of the data collection methods separately, now it's important to see them all at once. So we have the survey data as well as exit ticket data and observation data all in the same chart. So For the survey, the first line is actually the preference for routine or the rejection of routine. So we saw that there was a strong preference for routine, 84.45%, very low rejection, 2.22%, and then a few are undecided. As far as the exit tickets, these were positive learning responses for usual structure as compared to positive learning response for unusual structure. Because remember, I said that most of them were positive throughout, but either way, the positive learning response for usual structure was still slightly higher, being at 96.22% as compared to 60.71%. And then the last thing, observations. These were average engagement in usual structures, and remember the engagement behaviors being observed were the positive ones. There was a 59.73% engagement level of students for average engagement, and then for unusual structures it was at 40.27%. So we concluded that usual structure yielded higher average levels of engagement throughout the three data sets of the three the three different lessons, 2 lessons each, so the 6 overall lessons. So it is important to discuss how these results are really going to impact our profession, which is the whole reason why we're conducting the research in the first place, right? So the new insights that I gathered for the teaching role really were because of what I saw in the classroom during the behavioral observation portion, which was that the lack of structure is the culprit for many opportunities of misbehavior. So really, if you don't have the structure, it's similar to what we already know about classroom management. You're going to have some distractions that really will take away from the learning. So maintaining routines is a very key component to lesson success and then overall success of students in the classroom. New insights for students were aligned with that they have a strong preference for routines, and they have lots of habits with routines outside and inside the classroom. So it's important to conserve those things. The real world has routines in many different formats, and we are really preparing them for adulthood. So as far as theoretical assumptions and beliefs, I thought that familiarity would have bred contempt, but this was not the case in this particular context, that the familiarity that they had in the structure was actually beneficial to them and their engagement overall. As a reflection on ethical issues, my focus was upholding ethical issues for research gathering. And in this study, actually, each participant and their parental guardian was asked to sign consent forms to participate in the study and have their data published. And this upheld ethical standards of research in general, as well as those held by APU. These participants were asked to participate voluntarily and at no point were forced. And just as thought of before, we eliminated bias as much as possible. We did not misrepresent the data. We only reported what was actually found in the data collection processes, including those things that could have limited the data, such as absences or student behavioral issues, which we will get to in just a moment. Now I finally get to explain the limitations of the data, particularly those of day 4 of the behavioral observation. So day 4 was an unusual structure day, and it was so unstructured, compared to what they know, that it yielded very negative and disruptive behaviors to the point where the entire lesson had to be stopped and the behavior had to be remedied. They had to reflect on their behavior and what is expected of them. So in other words, we were testing the norms, in other words. And of course, we have to address those negative behaviors, otherwise it will persist. So that is why we don't have as high of data on those behavioral observational days. And as well, we don't have any of the exit ticket data for day 4 because they did not get to do that on that day because the lesson was stopped. So that explains that. And some potential next steps of inquiry that could be taken after this would be to apply this research approach to other age groups. So some of the research that I looked at in the literature review, those were done at elementary school age. So this approach could be applied not only to elementary school age, but also intermediate school age, or perhaps other classrooms, other districts that are also high school, like this particular study. We could also study the demographics of the participants and how they align with the attitudes and behaviors that they exhibit. We could also look at the teacher attitude survey, which would have some additional questions, but they would have that same feel to see maybe if the teacher attitudes themselves will affect how students engage in the classroom. And then lastly, if the lesson topics chosen themselves would actually increase or decrease engagement, as some students, they find grammar more boring than they would vocabulary. Vocabulary maybe excites them just a little bit more. So these sort of preferences. So some concluding thoughts. The purpose of this research was to study how lesson strategies affect student engagement. The 3 methods that were used were the attitude survey, behavior observations, and exit tickets about their overall confidence after each lesson. And the findings show that predictable structure yielded higher student engagement, and this aligned with their attitudes about routine, as most students stated in their attitude surveys that they did prefer routine. So overall, teachers should aim to mimic routines students would see in the real world in their classroom. Seeing the classroom and the real world as one and the same, and keeping routines in lesson structures increases student engagement. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I leave you with this quote: "Education is not preparation for life, it is life itself," by John Dewey. Thank you, and God bless you.